Hi, this is Chef Justin Watson, and today I'm going to show you how to make sourdough bread in a toaster oven. I've included a copy of the recipe here, or if you didn't have time to pause, it'll be available again at the end of the video. To get started, you're going to need a scale that is able to measure grams and a bowl large enough to both measure and mix the ingredients in. In my case, I'm using a glass bowl. Tare the scale so it measures 0. The first ingredient is 350 grams of water. I'm using filtered water, and while I've seen recipes that call for spring or even distilled water, I haven't had any issues with just using filtered tap water. Once again, remember to tare the scale back to 0. We will need 100 grams of sourdough starter next. I keep my sourdough starter out at room temperature, feeding it daily, and have a backup in the fridge that I feed weekly. You know the starter is ready when it floats on the water. I find feeding it the evening before works best. You can make your own starter, or even better, have a friend give you some of theirs. Mix a sourdough starter in water with a fork so that it can be evenly distributed in the flour and help with the fermentation process. Again, don't forget to tare your scale back to 0. Now we will need 500 grams of flour. I use a mix of all-purpose and whole wheat flour. We will start with 450 grams of the all-purpose flour. I prefer King Arthur brand for its superior quality, but I may be a little biased having grown up in Vermont. Next is the whole wheat flour, and we will need 50 grams of that. This will bring us to 500 grams total. You're able to adjust this ratio up or down depending on the flavor profile you want, or you can use only the all-purpose flour. Now that the flour has been added, we're going to mix it using a fork. This recipe doesn't even call for a mixer, yet another reason I like this method so much. You're not really kneading it, just incorporating and making sure all the water is mixed well with the flour. I've kept this part of the video in real time so that you're able to get an idea of about how long it takes and what to look for. You'll notice we haven't added the salt yet. That comes a little later in the process. First, we're going to allow this to autolyse, which basically means we are allowing all the water to be absorbed into the flour and the fermentation process to start. Salt inhibits the fermentation process, so that is why we leave it out and add it a little later. As you can see, the water and flour have combined and begun to pull away from the sides of the bowl into a ball. You can see the dough is not totally smooth like it would be if it were coming out of a mixer. As it rests in the next step, the moisture will come to the surface and the dough will become more elastic as the gluten begins to develop. Now we're going to cover the bowl. I'm using plastic wrap, but you can use a moist towel. You're just trying to prevent the dough from drying out. One of the tricks I use, instead of just leaving this out on the counter, I like to use my microwave. It can offer some insulation and a more consistent temperature. Set a timer for 30 minutes to let the dough rest. This does bring up a great point about an ingredient that wasn't listed on the recipe: patience. This process does take time. While the dough is resting for the initial 30 minutes, we can weigh out our salt in a separate bowl. Avoid measuring the salt directly into the big bowl. If you accidentally add too much, you could ruin the entire batch. We're looking for 10 grams of regular table salt. Once the initial 30-minute timer goes off, we can remove the dough and bring it back to the counter. Sprinkle the salt over the dough to help with even distribution. You can see the bowl of water that I dip my hands in to prevent the dough from sticking to your hands as much. Mix the dough by squeezing it between your fingers to try and incorporate the salt evenly throughout. As the dough begins to stick to your hands, place it back in the water again. Continue to massage the dough, twisting and flipping the dough as you go. It is important to mix the salt well, so take your time to make sure it's done thoroughly. Folding the edges of the dough into the center, rotating each time, is another technique that works well. If the dough starts to stick to your hands again, just place it back in the water. You might notice some of the dried up dough will stick to the edge of the bowl. That's where I use a tool called a bowl scraper. It's a flexible plastic rectangle with a curved edge to match the contour of the bowl. We will use this to clean up the edge of the bowl as well as to divide and scrape up the dough later in the recipe. If you're interested in this product, I've included a link in the description below to pick one up for yourself. Once the bowl has been scraped down and the dough is formed into a ball, cover it again with plastic wrap and place it back in the microwave. Set your timer for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, remove the bowl and bring it back to the counter. This is the first of 5 kneading sessions. Wet your hands again, this time grabbing the edge of the dough, stretching it out, and folding it into the center. Rotate the bowl 1/4 turn and repeat the process until you've made 2 full rotations. Once again, if your hands start to stick to the dough, you can place it back into the water. This process helps develop gluten and redistribute leavening organisms, but doesn't expel as much of the trapped CO2 from the dough compared to traditional kneading. Finally, flip the dough over, then place the plastic wrap back on top and put it back in the microwave to rest. Set the timer for 30 minutes. This same process will be repeated 4 more times. This is where the aforementioned patience comes into play. This whole process takes quite a bit of time, however, it is not constant time in the kitchen, and you can come back to it throughout the day. After you've kneaded and rested the dough 5 times, it's time to divide the dough. Use the bowl scraper to pull the dough out of the bowl and onto the counter. As you can see, I dipped the scraper in water to prevent it from sticking to the dough. Divide the dough into 2 even pieces, cutting and separating it with the bowl scraper. Now to shape the loaves, start by wetting your hands. Grab the top of the dough and fold it down towards the bottom. As you can see, the dough is sticking to this cutting board, and I probably should have just kept it on the counter. Now take each side of the dough and fold it into the center again. I'm using the scraper to help remove it from the cutting board. Finally, take the bottom and fold it up over the top and then into itself on the underside. Make sure your hands are plenty wet so that they don't stick, and then tuck the dough into the center on the bottom side, creating surface tension on top. Repeat this same process with the second loaf. Wash out and dry the bowl you used to mix the dough and grab a second bowl. This can be smaller but large enough to fit one of the loaves. Cut 2 pieces of parchment that are around 8 inches square. Place each loaf on the center of the parchment and place that in the bowl. Cover one of the bowls with plastic wrap. Now to make a proofing box using a microwave. Start by placing a shallow bowl or pie dish in the bottom of the microwave. Add some water to the dish. Microwave the water on high for 5 minutes to heat up the microwave cavity and fill it with steam. Place a wire rack on top of the dish, then place the uncovered loaf of bread onto the rack and shut the door. Set another timer for 30 minutes. Preheat the toaster oven and 2 small cast iron skillets to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the timer goes off and the oven and pans are preheated, remove the bread and cast iron and place it on the counter. Using the edge of the parchment paper, remove the proofed loaves from the bowls and place them in the center of the skillet. Grab a small cup of water and a sharp paring knife. Wetting your fingertips and the knife to prevent them from sticking to the dough, carefully score the top of the loaf. Invert the second cast iron skillet and place it on top of the first. Carefully place the cast iron pans into your toaster oven. Set a timer for 14 minutes. Once the 14-minute timer has passed, rotate your pans in the toaster oven. Set the timer for another 14 minutes. When the next timer goes off, remove the pans from the oven. Carefully remove the parchment paper from the underside of the loaf. Return the loaf back to the oven and set a timer for 5 minutes. All these times may vary depending on your oven, but this is a good guideline to start with. While your first loaf is browning in the oven, you can place your second loaf into the cast iron pan. Once the bread is golden brown, remove it from the oven and place it on a cooling rack. Place your second loaf into the toaster oven. Thanks for sticking with me to the end of the video. This is my very first upload to YouTube, so I'd appreciate any feedback you give me in the comments. Let me know if you'd like this style of recipe or what you find might improve it. If you've enjoyed this recipe, hit the like button. My plan is to upload some videos on cooking fundamentals as well as additional recipes. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, hit that subscribe button. And remember, mise en place. It's a way of life.